to be sure, if you've watched my Marvel Cinematic Universe Analyzed video from a couple years ago, you know that I don't love every Marvel movie. There are a good number of them that I think are just mostly passable entertainment and nothing amazing. But even the movies that I don't think are objectively great, I still like and appreciate as a fan, and almost all of them hold a place in this cinematic universe that's important and enjoyable. Except Thor the Dark World, according to Chris Hemsworth. Good night, sweet prince. And then there are the installments that truly are impressive, memorable, and well-executed pieces of action filmmaking. Iron Man, Captain America 2 and 3, Guardians Volume 1 and 2, Good Night, Sweet Prince, Spider-Man Homecoming, Black Panther, Infinity War. Oh yeah, Infinity War! I reviewed Infinity War on my channel in a 15-minute ramble video when I first saw the film, which you can go back and rewatch if you want, but I'd really say my opinions on the movie had developed a lot since I first watched it, and that's part of what this retrospective will tackle. I saw Infinity War, 4 times in theaters? But since I've had it on DVD, I've rewatched it at least 6 or 7 more. Mostly to take notes for this thing. So what is this whole Infinity War retrospective nonsense thing gonna be? Well, for one thing, I want to talk about how the film has aged as a few months have gone past. Talk about cultural impact and how I think it'll be viewed in another 10 years, even though, it's only been out since April. I also want to discuss the film's place in the larger Marvel Cinematic Universe, like how meaningful certain aspects of the plot are when you read them in context of the other 18 movies, or how some of the character arcs pay off things that have been alluded to for a long time in this series. Just, talking about the MCU. So with that, let's get into my Marvel retrospective. Alright, before we get into the craziness and complicated analysis, let me just set the stage and briefly tell you what I think of Infinity War now that several months have passed. In my initial review for Infinity War, I said that this is Marvel's best event, it's their best spectacle, but it is not their best film. They've made far better films than this in the past. This is Marvel's best event, it's their best spectacle, but it's not their best film. They have made far better films than this in the past. I just said that, and I'd still agree with that sentiment. I think some of the more intimate, small-scale movies like Cap Winter Soldier or Iron Man will always be better films in my eyes because they have more time for character. But that said, with every rewatch, Infinity War's status as a film and an event has done nothing but improve for me. I think it's a mind-blowing achievement that Christopher Marcus, Stephen McFeely, and the Russo brothers managed to pull off a movie with so much going on and still make it feel coherent, satisfying, and layered. I also think it's indicative of how skilled they are as storytellers that despite the fact that this movie has 10 times more characters and subplots than something like Age of Ultron does, Infinity War actually feels less crowded. The scope of this film is undoubtedly the grandest the MCU has ever attempted. The first few phases of the Marvel Universe felt in many ways like superheroes entering the real world, especially when the major catalyst for their involvement was a government agency and not anything cosmic. But recently, things have been changing. Infinity War feels less like the real world and more like a comic book universe showcasing everything it has to offer. Places like Nidavellir, Nowhere, and Wakanda, and characters that range from giant dwarves to talking raccoons all serve to make this feel like a universe that's come a long way since Iron Man was busting terrorists in Afghanistan. I also love that the movie feels dramatic. The bombastic Silvestri score, the bold and elegant location title cards, and the sense of weight and anticipation involved really give the entire film the feeling of an operatic conclusion instead of just another throwaway adventure. Even the opening scene instantly instills dread and build-up for what Thanos will bring with him. And the writers aren't afraid to get rid of things that have been around in the MCU for a while, be it the long-time plot device of the Tesseract or the original villain of the Avengers himself. Beyond just the opening scene, in general, I love that this movie, for the first time in the MCU, doesn't feel like it's just maintaining the status quo. Big things are happening that will likely change the fate of the series permanently. There's not much in Infinity War that feels unnecessary either. Even scenes that would normally be included in a big blockbuster don't really show up because they're not important. This film is also unique from a visual perspective in the MCU. The color grading issues I complained about with other Marvel movies in previous videos? Yeah, there's none of that here. This is without a doubt the most vibrant, comic booky, and often psychedelic the MCU has ever been visually. And it's not just the poppy VFX by Weta and ILM, though they are incredible, it's also the cinematography and direction that just feels more experimental and unique. Breathtaking one-take shots like this would never have showed up in previous MCU movies. Wait, is that who I think it is? Curse you, Sony! If I have any withstanding complaints about the film, they're probably that some of the humor is a little overdone at points, and there are a couple action scenes that are somewhat forgettable. I also don't love the shaky cam in the Wakanda battle. I mean, it's fine, and that sequence has a lot of great moments, but if you compare it to something as gracefully orchestrated as the Thanos fight on Titan, it really doesn't hold a candle. Also, hot take, I guess, but Bruce Banner is just no good when he's directed by anyone other than Joss Whedon. I get that Ruffalo is going for the whole, I've been Hulk for 3 years and I'm awkward now thing, but it's just weird. He feels like a way less interesting character. And can we all agree the invisible Drax scene was pretty bad? I mean, don't get me wrong, I think the Guardians were done really well in general, but if there was one thing I'd cut from the movie, it would literally just be that scene. That's my director's cut. It's the whole movie without that one scene. Oh, and without this line.
You can't be a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man if there's no neighborhood. Okay, that didn't really make sense, but you know what I'm trying to say.
What do you mean that doesn't make sense, Peter? That makes total sense. Stop beating yourself up, man. You're fine. So those are some of my basic thoughts about the movie. Without stalling any further, I guess it's time to get into some of my more abstract opinions about the film. Sorry, that sounded pretentious. This is just a superhero movie. I don't want to sound pretentious. Avengers Infinity War is the 19th installment in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which means it took a lot of build-up to get to where we are now, and that's a fact that the TV spots and trailers will not let you forget. Still, it's pretty impressive that things that were set up almost a decade ago in this series are finally being paid off in a way that's satisfying. You've got the obvious stuff, like Thanos showing up all the way back in 2012 and the Infinity Stones being scattered throughout the series, but then there are even the little things that make a difference. Be it the art departments on Infinity War and Black Panther working together to make Wakanda feel consistent, or the VFX teams using the Chitauri models from the Avengers in the flashback to Thanos' army, offhand lines in Spider-Man Homecoming that allude to Tony Stark's daddy issues,
Gotta sound like my dad.
keeping a large number of big-name actors around to star in minor cameo roles, or how Age of Ultron brings back that guy from the Winter Soldier. I like that guy. The point is, the attention to detail in the MCU has rarely faltered, and that's probably because the guy running this whole thing is a giant fanboy himself. After watching Infinity War, it really becomes crystal clear how necessary all of the MCU movies, even the mediocre ones, were to set up something like this. If it weren't for Guardians 2, Thanos' abusive relationship with Gamora and Nebula would have no weight. If it weren't for Homecoming, Tony Stark's father-son relationship with Peter Parker would feel hollow. The investment and emotion are built on the context in a look how far we've come sort of way. Seeing Peter Parker go into space and get his Iron Spider suit is satisfying because we know the small-scale adventures Spidey has had up till now, and we realize what a big change this is for him. That's why, realistically, I think in order to engage and feel with the MCU, you really do have to have seen most of the movies in the series. You can make a list of all the films you have to see to understand Infinity War, but then those movies require you to see other movies to understand them. It's interesting to talk about Infinity War through the lens of it being a payoff to 10 years of setup, though, because that was a big conversation during the first few weeks the movie was out. Some critics, including in a few ways myself, wanted to judge Infinity War in a vacuum, ignoring the context leading up to it and picking apart the semi-shallowness of the film as a whole. This movie on its own doesn't have that much time for many character arcs or meaningful dialogue, or really anything that most people would consider necessary to writing a film with depth. But Infinity War doesn't exist in a vacuum. Marvel spent a decade making 18 movies to lead up to it so that it would work as well as it does, and to ignore those movies is to ignore the basis of the film's existence entirely. This is the culmination of all that came before, and many of the dramatic beats depend on what we know from other films. I don't think that's necessarily lazy writing, it's just the basis of a film this ambitious and culminating. You could say Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 doesn't work on its own, but that's why you watched all the previous 7 movies, so that it would work. I don't think this concept is at all foreign to audiences at this point either. There was a time when cinematic universe storytelling was alien to the mainstream, but over the past 10 years, we've all become literate in reading this new form of narrative, and Marvel knows that. If there's one thing I'd change about my assessment of Infinity War from when I first saw it, it would be the statement that it's not a complete film, that it feels more like a part 1 than a finale. Especially after the rewatches, I think it's abundantly clear that it is complete. It may not be satisfying and the heroes may not win, but Infinity War is a tragedy, and it functions as such. Upon the initial viewing of Infinity War, much of the first half of the story is extremely exhilarating, charming, and even funny. Seeing your favorite characters meet each other, the exchange of quips and one-liners, the action beats throughout that seem triumphant, it all feels like another breezy Avengers movie. On the second go around, though, that sense of breeziness is lost almost entirely, becoming almost like an elaborate misdirection to make you think things will play out like they always do, when in fact the character's sense of confidence that they'll win is their downfall. The Russos know what the audience's expectations are, and boy did they upstage them. And that's not to say that the movie ceases to be enjoyable on a second viewing, it's just that you begin to see that the ending of the story was inevitable, and even from the beginning, these characters were bound to lose. Thor's quest to forge a new hammer becomes gloomy when you know what it leads to, and you realize he's making the same mistakes he always has. Peter saying,
I should have stayed on the bus.
Makes you go, yeah boy, you should have stayed on the bus! Even something charming on the first viewing, like Tony Stark talking to Pepper about having a son, becomes instantly tragic on the second when you realize that he'll lose a young surrogate son by the end of the film, with even Pepper's fate uncertain. By that token, the movie also makes an effort to remind us of some of the long-running love-struck pairings in the MCU, from Pepper and Tony to Bruce and Natasha to Peter and Gamora and Wanda and Vision, all so that it can take them away from us, or at least make them feel tragically naive by the end. These movies, for all their effects and action, are still built on relationships and characters. And on that note, I want to focus the rest of this video on the specific heroes and villains in Infinity War who are given meaningful development, especially when you read it in context of their other films. So without further ado, let's talk about What would you do with the Infinity Gauntlet?
Hookers and blackjack?
Okay.
Hookers and blackjack, right? What would you do with the Infinity Gauntlet, Zoidberg?
I'd ask for friends.
Aww.
It's not that powerful.
That's true. It's important to recognize that the majority of Infinity War is action. That's just a fact. But while in many other films, having non-stop action could simply eclipse the story and characters, Infinity War is great at instilling every scene it depicts with important drama and emotional beats that keep the character arcs alive. This isn't just empty spectacle, and it's important to examine why that is. So, because I really admire his content, and I wanted another voice than mine in this video, I got my good friend Films and Stuff to cover that very subject.
Of action scenes, few can deny that directors Anthony and Joe Russo have elevated the art form of the superhero set piece. Every single action scene in their two Captain America films are jam-packed with clever choreography, kinetic motion, and important character moments. When I think about their action, I think about the multiple ways in which their characters interact with each other, the way they keep coming up with new ways for their characters to showcase their powers. It's the expression of character that really matters in these large-scale action scenes. What reveals the most about a character's intentions are the way that they move. Action is character. Avengers Infinity War certainly puts this idea to the test, telling a story with over 20 important characters and twice as many minutes of action. Many of these characters have no more than a couple of speaking lines, and thus have to prove their worth through their shared action screen time. Now, before we talk about these fight scenes and how they function, we also have to discuss their MacGuffins, the Infinity Stones. Every single action scene revolves around protecting or retrieving one of these stones. Many characters are tasked with containing these stones, with some being tied to their fate. Because of this, the action scenes less resemble the typical fight the army, save the city, and stop the Doomsday Device format we're so familiar with, and more become an intricate game of hot potato, as the stones and their keepers go in and out of trouble. The vast majority of characters showcase their powers through their attempts to protect these stones, and the way in which the film is able to juggle so many different characters within these action scenes is through an action filmmaking principle called the reversal. The best way to understand the function of a reversal is to break action scenes down into verbs. At any given point, Alright, enough about reversals. Let's get back to the idea that action is character. While every character is tasked with the same mission, the manner in which they take on this task becomes another form of character expression. Everyone gets the same call to action, but their actions are all over the place. Tony Stark, for instance, chases after Doctor Strange and the Time Stone in space, using Ebony Maw's ship as an opportunity to take the fight to Thanos. Captain America, on the other hand, stays grounded on Earth, rescuing Vision and the Mind Stone to take them to the safest place he knows. Thor ignores the stones entirely and decides to venture off and make a weapon capable of killing Thanos. These forms of action and how the Avengers engage with Thanos are not only specific to their power sets, but also reflect upon the driving forces of these characters, how Tony needs to confront Thanos and the fear he represents. How Captain America, when put into a fight, will always prioritize protecting his fellow soldier. How Thor is so driven by grief that he only seeks vengeance.
You die for that.
All three of these missions, these three different mindsets,
great insight. I mean, as of the recording of this clip, I haven't actually seen the insight, but based on the track record, I'm going to assume it was pretty good. Ever since the beginning, the appeal of the MCU has always come from the characters. Nobody cares about the plot of most Marvel movies. They care about seeing how the heroes will respond to the plot, and especially in the team-up movies, how the heroes will respond to each other. The biggest selling point of the first Avengers movie was seeing completely different characters like Thor and Iron Man and Captain America all collide in one event. And as of yet, the rush audiences get from seeing their favorite heroes cross paths really hasn't faded. People didn't just want Spider-Man in the MCU because Marvel Studios would make better movies about him. They wanted Spider-Man in the MCU because it would be so much fun to see him meet everybody else. Same goes for the X-Men and the Fantastic Four. And nowhere is that joy in character combos more present than in Infinity War. So many different interactions here had to be nailed just right, and for the most part, they're perfectly executed. The level of thought and care put into the combinations of the characters in the film becomes so clear as the story goes on. Dynamics like Thor and Rocket and Tony and Doctor Strange provide meaningful contrast to highlight who each hero really is by showing who they're not. Given how huge Infinity War is, both in cast and scope, naturally most of the characters have reasonably minor roles, even some who have usually been major players in years past. Characters like Doctor Strange and Bruce Banner and even Spider-Man are all portrayed as supporting cast because we see them mainly through the eyes of other characters, rarely getting inside their headspace. In many ways, I actually think this serves some of the heroes better than individual solo films. Sure, Doctor Strange is okay in his own movie, but his appearances in both Thor Ragnarok and Infinity War each felt more satisfying than seeing him on his own. The same could be said for someone like Ant-Man or Hulk. The minor roles are actually more interesting than the major ones. Still, even despite the fact that many characters are relegated to supporting cast here, the film does choose to focus on a select few heroes more than others, and many of them are surprising choices at first. The characters I want to talk about now are Thor, Gamora, Tony Stark, and Thanos. What do you think that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles would do if they had the Infinity Gauntlet?
If the Ninja Turtles would do? Well, they're a bunch of do-gooders. You know, they wouldn't do anything with it. Now, if I have that ability, I guarantee I would use it inappropriately. If I have the Infinity Gauntlet, first off, what's the first thing I would wish for? Another Infinity Gauntlet. Then I'd have a matching set.
Thor has had a complicated history in the MCU. His first two films, Thor and Thor the Dark World, were decently well-received solo movies, but they're definitely not anyone's favorite. The gimmick with Thor's character has always been that he's an old-fashioned Norse god who's never been to Earth, and he's confused by humans and our weird customs. Basically a fish-out-of-water type deal.
I know, it's great, right?
Another!
And for a couple movies, that was pretty charming. Thor's presence in both his first movie and The Avengers is very entertaining and likable. But while characters like Tony Stark and Captain America were both evolving and growing in major ways with every installment in Phase 2, Thor had mostly stayed the same in every movie he'd appeared in up through Age of Ultron. Enter Thor Ragnarok. Now look, I'm not the world's biggest fan of Ragnarok. I mean, I think it's fun but reasonably overrated. The wackiest, weirdest stuff is great, but there's still a fair amount of cliche superhero movie tropes. Hela is a sucky villain, and most of the truly emotional or thought-provoking concepts are undercut with jokes a little too often for my taste. But no matter what you think of Ragnarok as a film in general, it's hard not to commend Taika Waititi for what he did to breathe new life into the character of Thor himself. Ragnarok basically made Thor cool again, and not just because he suddenly had super awesome lightning powers or a way better haircut, although, let's be honest, that's part of it, but also because as a character, Thor was savvier. In the time since Age of Ultron, he'd grown as a hero into someone who wasn't nearly as self-serious or melodramatic, and it seemed like he understood the ways of the world more than he used to. All of a sudden, Thor was lighter, funnier, and he seemed like he knew he was in a superhero movie. When I first saw Ragnarok, I argued that this was a negative change because it made Thor more like every other quippy, self-aware protagonist in the MCU and less like himself. But as time has passed, I've realized that either way, it was a pretty necessary shift to keep the character relevant. And that's where Infinity War comes in, because while I did have some problems with Thor's sudden change of character in Ragnarok, going from a burdened, self-important hero to a happy-go-lucky guy, Infinity War solves all of those problems by portraying them in a different light. When Infinity War was still in its early stages, the writers and directors both claimed that Thor would be one of the most prominent characters in the film, which really surprised most people. It seemed like Tony Stark or Captain America or even Black Panther would all be more suited for a leading role than him. But after Infinity War came out, one of the things almost everyone unanimously agreed on was that Thor's character, and Chris Hemsworth's performance, was one of the highlights of the movie by far. In the commentary track for the film, the Russo brothers talk about how they wanted to set up Thor as the yin to Thanos' yang from a plot perspective, and make the audience believe that he would be the one to defeat him in the end. They do this first by stripping the character of everything he cares about, his people, his brother, even the victory of his previous movie, and leaving him as the underdog of all the heroes. And that's where the brilliance of the Russos' direction really begins to shine, because instead of once again changing the character of Thor and making him into a stoic, sullen-faced warrior who's lost all hope, after they take everything away from Thor, they still maintain his personality as the happy-go-lucky action hero he became in Ragnarok. The only difference is they reframe his humor and positivity as the way he copes with all this pain and loss. This is a guy who's lived for thousands of years, and at this point things are getting repetitive and tiring. His brother has died multiple times. He's defeated countless world-dominating villains, but more just keep popping up again and again. Thor basically has superhero movie fatigue. But the thing that makes him so likable and charming and easy to get behind? It's that despite all this, he's fighting his hardest to stay positive and macho through it all, even when he's dying inside. The conversation between Rocket and Thor in the pod, potentially my favorite scene in the whole movie, is a perfect example of the depth the Russos managed to project into the character and the way Chris Hemsworth portrayed it perfectly.
Well, if I'm wrong, then what more could I lose?
This is why Thor's arrival in Wakanda is such an awesome, showstopper, crowd-pleasing moment. We've seen this character lose everything, but through sheer force of will and selflessness, he's forged the weapon he needs, he's teamed up with the Guardians, and he's in his prime, in the perfect position to defeat Thanos. Or at least, that's what it seems like. That positivity and heroism the audience loved about the character for most of the runtime also shows that it has a bad side. The fact that Thor has been through this much and still remains certain he can win does reflect some of the ego the character has always had. And that ego, that overconfidence that he can win, and the reckless urge to get revenge on his antagonist, is exactly what keeps Thor from killing Thanos in the end. Let's talk about Gamora. father. There's no moment when she's not willing to give her life to stop him, and the only thing that gets in her way is her sister Nebula. Just like Gamora, I wasn't a big fan of Nebula in the first Guardians movie either. I thought Karen Gillan's performance was a bit one-note and cartoony, and James Gunn's idea of a Nebula solo movie always sounded, frankly, pretty bad. Still, by the time Guardians Volume 2 was finished, the character had been given a suitable amount of depth that hadn't been there before, and her relationship with her sister was nothing short of heartbreaking. It's context like this that makes the dramatic beats in Infinity War all the more meaningful. When you realize Gamora has always felt guilty about Nebula's abuse under their father, the idea that she'd relinquish the Soul Stone just to make sure her sister is okay suddenly becomes more believable emotionally. Gamora's untimely demise at the hands of her father, further driving home the idea that Thanos has the strongest will in the film, works so well because the audience subconsciously prepared themselves for her death when she asked Peter to kill her, but it was assumed that if she died, it would be for a noble cause. This cause? This is just tragedy, even for the man who thought he had to do it. And that comes as a shock. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. Let's move on and talk about our final two characters, Tony Stark and Thanos.
Santa got an upgrade for Christmas.
So here we are, talking about the two most important characters in all of Infinity War. Why did I pair Tony and Thanos together? Well, if Thor and Thanos are the yin and yang from a plot perspective, Tony and Thanos are definitely the yin and yang from a thematic perspective. Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark is Marvel's headline superhero, a perfect picture of what it looks like when an actor captures a persona to a T. He's also, and you can quote me on this, one of the most fascinating and rich cinematic characters of the past decade, especially when you consider that he's been constantly evolving throughout that decade. When we first met Tony Stark, the first major change he went through was learning to care about people other than himself, chiefly his assistant Pepper and those affected by his war profiteering. And since then, we've seen him continue to learn to work with others and develop selfless relationships to the point where deep down he's actually terrified of losing his newfound friends and feels responsible for their well-being. Another thing that's stayed consistent since Tony Stark's introduction is how concerned he is with his own legacy. How will he be remembered when he's gone? Will he leave as big an impact as his father Howard did? And will people view him as a hero or an egotist? Stark's journey in the MCU started as an attempt to atone for his sins, restart his life, and be a better person, even when society told him he was crazy. But deep down, sometimes it seems like no matter how hard he's tried to be selfless, to give to the next generation, to create peace for the world, some people will still view him as the warmonger and narcissist that he started out as. And that hurts.
You think you fight for us? You just fight for yourself.
I've seen the footage. The only thing you really fight for is yourself. You're not the guy to make the sacrifice play, to lay down on a wire and let the other guy crawl over you.
I think I would just cut the wire.
One of the most important things to remember about Stark in the MCU is that just as much as he was in the comics, he is an addict. Now granted, in the comic books, Tony Stark's addiction manifests mainly as alcoholism, and we do see a little bit of that in Iron Man 2, but not much after. In the movies, Tony's addictive nature often takes a different form, transposed from alcohol to other more personal things, like his obsession and addiction to security and even paranoia.
A few years ago, I almost lost her, so I trashed all my suits. Then we had to mop up Hydra, and then Ultron. My fault. And then, I never stopped. Because the truth is, I don't want to stop.
Most of this stems from Tony's experiences in the Battle of New York, which the MCU uses as a major catalyst for his character growth, or in some ways lack thereof, in the next several movies. Iron Man 3 depicts Tony as a man suffering from PTSD due to the magnitude of the threat he faced a year prior. His response to this, the fear that he is not enough to stop the next army that attacks from space, is to become severely addicted to creating specialty Iron Man suits for every possible circumstance to protect himself and his girlfriend. He effectively creates high-tech cocoons for his fears. Iron Man 3, of course, ends with Tony learning to be a hero without the suits, blowing all of them up at the end and having his arc reactor removed so that he doesn't have an excuse to say he needs them anymore. Unfortunately, though, addiction rarely dies, it just takes a new form, and that's exactly what Tony's does in Avengers Age of Ultron, as even though he's decided that he doesn't need the Iron Man suits to keep himself safe anymore, Tony's fear that the Avengers will not be strong enough to stop the next threat starts an obsession with creating a suit of armor around the world.
I see a suit of armor around the world.
Sounds like a cold world, Tony.
I've seen colder.
This obsession, of course, ultimately leads to Ultron and all the destruction that follows, and the ensuing chaos is only stopped by Tony's second creation, Vision, the technological savior and the only one capable of stopping what Stark has started. And at the end of Age of Ultron, it seems like Vision might be the answer to Tony's problems. Tony may not be worthy enough to lift Thor's hammer, but he's created a seemingly infallible machine who is. He feels like he might have finally made something that allows him to settle down with Pepper for good.
Well, it's time for me to tap out.
What Stark's character is doing in Iron Man 3 and Age of Ultron and all the movies following is repeatedly trying to pass off the responsibility of protecting the Earth to a force stronger and more capable than himself so that he won't have to worry about it again, and his obsession with security can finally end. Tony has been a man driven by guilt ever since he first became Iron Man, and that guilt, coupled with the fear that he's the only one who can stop the next invasion, is weighing him down. As he tells Banner, wouldn't it be great to have peace and our time?
Peace in our time.
Peace in our time.
Tony's desire to shed his obsession with heroism is why even in the Avengers movies, he's content with calling Captain America the leader of the team. He doesn't want that responsibility forced upon himself.
Oh, actually, he's the boss. I just pay for everything and design everything and make everyone look cooler.
The Sokovia Accords in Civil War represent the same desire. Tony's guilt over the destruction caused in Age of Ultron and other guilt he's carried with him even since his time as an arms dealer leads him to believe that if he can sign a document passing the responsibility of the Avengers' actions, good and bad, to the UN, he might finally rest easy and be able to take a step back. Of course, this doesn't come to pass. Tony's attempts to secure the Avengers team end up completely splitting them apart. And worse still, his supposedly perfect creation of Vision in Age of Ultron, the one thing he's invented that hasn't turned out horribly wrong, ends up nearly killing his best friend, proving that he's not as infallible as Tony created him to be.
How did this happen? I became distracted.
So Tony Stark is a man who is addicted to trying to save the world, but it all stems from ultimately wanting to find a permanent solution or defense so that his obsession can finally come to the end of the line.
It's the end of the line.
Tony's desire to pass the torch and find the final resting place has manifested in suits, it's manifested in Ultron and Vision, it's manifested in the Sokovia Accords, and it's manifested in trying to pass the mantle of Iron Man to another generation, be it his mentorship to Harley in Iron Man 3 or his father-son dynamic with Peter Parker in Homecoming. Tony just wants to find a way to retire and let other heroes worry about the world for him. But in doing this, he's constantly trying to win a war before it even starts.
Isn't that the mission? Isn't that the why we fight? So we can end the fight, so we get to go home? Every time someone tries to win a war before it starts, innocent people die. Every time.
And this is where the parallels between Tony Stark and Thanos really come into view, because almost everything I just said about Tony is true of Thanos too. And mind you, every Avengers movie thus far has had a villain with some similarity to Iron Man, but there's a reason Infinity War draws such a clear connection. Tony mentions how Thanos has been inside his head for years, acknowledging that much of his paranoia has come from the idea of the Mad Titan even before he knew his name.
It's you who doesn't understand that Thanos has been inside my head for 6 years, since he sent an army to New York, and now he's back. And I don't know what to do.
Tony is also the only Avenger that Thanos recognizes and knows by name.
Stark.
You know me?
I do. You're not the only one cursed with knowledge.
Thanos is wise to see that despite completely different strategies and mindsets, Stark and himself are two very similar individuals. Tony and Thanos are both futurists, obsessed with their own legacy and burdened with the weight of the universe because they feel like they're the only ones who know what they know.
The futurist, gentlemen! The futurist is here! He sees all. He knows what's best for you, whether you like it or not.
Tony has felt ever since the Battle of New York like he's the only one who's aware and readily preparing for another invasion like it. And he also seems like the only guy who fears that the Avengers might not be enough to stop it a second time.
How are you guys planning on beating that? Together.
we'll lose. And we'll do that together, too.
Thanos has felt like he has the solution to overpopulation ever since his planet was on the brink of collapse, and nobody believed him then. His strong, obsessive will pushes him to never let that circumstance happen again, with anyone who contradicts his plan or tries to reason with him being viewed as a child who doesn't understand the situation.
It needs correction.
You don't know that!
I'm the only one who knows that.
Thanos thinks he's the father of the universe, and he knows best. This is why even when people pick apart Thanos' plan by pointing out things like how he could have just increased the food supply or made new planets, it doesn't matter to him. This guy has had an idea for how to save the universe rattling around in his head, eating away at him ever since his own planet collapsed, and he believes he's the only person who understands the circumstance. People who say Thanos is a twisted, abusive, terrible person who shouldn't be viewed as a hero are obviously correct, like duh. But Infinity War is more about how Thanos views himself as a hero in his own head and why he can't be reasoned with. Ultimately, one of the biggest parallels between Stark and Thanos is that while both of them do feel burdened by a mission that they only... Ultimately, one of the biggest parallels between Stark and Thanos is that while the two of them both feel burdened by a task that only they can fulfill, they also just want to settle down and know that they've completed their mission for good.
Maybe I should take a page out of Barton's book. Build Pepper a farm. Hope nobody blows it up. The simple life.
When I first saw Infinity War, I thought the ending was a little cheap, given that we know most of these characters will be back. But after seeing it again, I feel like the point is less about the people who died and more about the visceral feeling of loss, both in the audience and the people left behind without their loved ones. Some of these people have even lost the same loved ones before. Steve is forced to relive Bucky's death, Okoye is forced to relive T'Challa's death, Rocket is forced to relive Groot's death. It's all about the people who lose it all. And I think on that front, the tragic ending of this installment puts the original surviving Avengers team in a far more intimate, compelling place for Avengers 4. Instead of a movie about a villain who rises from nothing, whose plans are thwarted before they come to fruition, Avengers 4 will see the heroes challenging a god who already won and just wants to maintain the status quo. If they weren't already, the Avengers are absolutely the underdogs now. And you can bet Tony Stark is out for revenge. So why did Thanos win? What makes Thanos such a phenomenal villain and formidable foe? It's his strong will and obsessive conviction. If Infinity War is a movie about sacrifices, Thanos is the only character in the film who doesn't hesitate to make them. And it's easy to step back and say, why didn't Wanda just kill Vision earlier? Or why did Quill have to mess up the plan? But if you look at the characters, every decision they make is completely in accordance with who they are, weaknesses included. Vision and Wanda but Infinity War is a tragedy more than anything else. The story is a messy convergence of strong wills, ego shrouding better judgment, and the empty, draining feeling of loss that must overcome a person before they can do anything to fight it. There are a lot of Marvel movies that don't improve upon the rewatch, instead becoming more and more cliche and predictable on the second viewing, or less funny because you know all the jokes. Infinity War is not that way. In all my rewatches of the film to make this video, and all the lenses through which I viewed it, the movie did nothing but improve. The action is top-notch, memorable, and packed with character beats that give it meaning. The pacing is relentless, stopping only for what's most important and never feeling dull. The characters are all written with a heavy knowledge of their past story arcs, and they each act according to who they are at all times. The VFX and CGI are gorgeous and near photorealistic, and even when they don't look perfect, the performances of the actors sell them anyway. And most of all, this is an event movie that doesn't lose its heart and soul. It may not be flawless, but this is Marvel's masterpiece. This is the culmination of everything they've worked toward, and it's more than just explosions and CGI. Infinity War is an achievement like no other. It concludes and pays homage to every arc in the MCU while also offering a satisfying story of its own. I am beyond blown away. Well, DragonCon has been fun. We saw tons of costumes and cosplays and vendors, and my friend and I met Napoleon Dynamite, by the way, but it's finally coming to a close. I want to thank my friend Jonathan from Films and Stuff for co-starring in this video even shortly, and I want to thank the viewers for watching it in the first place. Seriously guys, thanks so much for checking this out. I've spent the last month making it, so I hope you found it entertaining and informative. Also, a special thanks goes out to the patrons over on Patreon. It's only $1 a month, but you get behind-the-scenes content and unscripted rambles and video previews, so I'm very thankful for their support and thankful for the new patrons. Alright, self-promotion part is over. Wakanda forever. That's the real deal. So here we are, it's the end of the video. We've talked about Infinity War, we've been to DragonCon, and I want to know about your thoughts about the movie in the comments below. Be sure to follow me on Patreon, and thanks for watching.
How do you do that?
Oh.